All right. So smoke tests and snapshot tests are definitely useful. They're easy to write, but often we want to test more specialized pieces of our components. We want to test the events, the interactions, what actually happens when a user does something with a component. We don't just want to test that it renders successfully or that the rendering is the same as it was last time it rendered, but also what happens when the user clicks this button versus the other button, the cancel button versus the submit button, or the, increment quantity versus decrement quantity, the delete button, the edit button, what happens when a user submits the form. Those are all things that we might want to test, and smoke or snapshot tests aren't really going to cut it to get that finer level of detail in our tests. So how do we test React components that have events, or how do we test the actual events, the clicks, form submits, input, events, typing, all that stuff? And how do we test that we get the desired change in output or in what's rendered in the given component? Well, we're going to talk more about a bunch of methods. I'm just going to show you very quickly how many different methods we're going to quickly run through. So I do not expect you to fully understand and memorize and use all of these methods. I just want to point them out, sort of give you a broad survey, and then we'll write a couple tests, and you'll have the tools at that point. You'll know the documentation, where to find it, so that you can write more complex tests as well. So when we use this React testing library, we call render, which we've been doing over and over. Right here, we're calling render. In our smoke test, we render. In the snapshot test, we render. And render returns a object that has a bunch of methods on it, including as fragment. But we also have a lot more methods that we get access to, thanks to React testing library. So these methods, this first batch at least, helps us find elements or get elements in the DOM based off of text. So get by text is going to find the first matching element by some text. So we could pass in text that says, get by text, submit, or quantity, or increment, or hello, whatever the text is that we're trying to search. We're going to get the first matching element. So not the text, but the element based off of its text. It's kind of like query selector if you could write a query selector in the DOM to select based off of text. Then we have query by text, which is slightly different. It's the same idea. Find the first matching element by its text, but it's not going to throw an error if it can't find anything like get by text does. Instead, it returns null if nothing was found. Then we have a get all by text and a query all by text. So they are very similar, but they're going to find all matches, not just the first match. Get all by text will throw an error if nothing is found. Query all by text won't. Render, that object we get back from render, also has other methods. Get by placeholder / query by placeholder, same pattern. So get by is going to give us an error if it can't find something. Query by won't. So this is going to find the first matching element based off of placeholder text. We can find inputs based off of placeholder text. Same thing, get all by placeholder, query all by placeholder. Now this one is a little bit different, get by test ID or query by test ID. If there's something that you need to test, some element that you cannot find conveniently or easily using the other methods we've talked about, getting by text or by placeholder, you can use a test ID, which is just an attribute that you add to the element. Data-test ID. It's kind of a last resort, but it is a way that we can find a particular element. We add a data test ID attribute. We've talked about data attributes in the past, and then you can get by or query by that test ID. There's also get all by test ID and query all by test ID. So on the testing library docs under queries, there is a full page that goes into all the different queries. So there's different patterns, right? Get by, get all by, query all by. We've already talked about that. And then after that, so all of the methods are going to start with get by, get all by, query all by, etc. Then there are different things that we can get by label text. So that's one I didn't include in the slides, but you can find something based off of its label text. You can find something based off of placeholder text, as we've already seen, or just by the text content the element contains. Alt text, get something by title, by display value. What else? By role. So if you have different role attributes set up on your elements, by test ID. So the docs can be a little bit confusing if you don't read this part at the beginning. So the method names are not by label text or by placeholder text. The method names are going to start with get all by or query all by, and then we add on one of these suffixes, one of the variants by placeholder text, and so on. So why don't we get some practice? Why don't we actually try using these methods to query? How about our counter component? So this counter component eventually will be testing the interaction when you click on this button. Does it actually increment count, and is that change reflected here? But why don't we begin by selecting, how about this H1, just to get some practice? So we don't select by element, we don't select by tag name, we select by text, or that's at least one option. Remember, the React testing library, or just testing library in general, on their homepage, they talk about the philosophy of testing, mimicking the way a user interacts with your page, not the way a developer would. So instead of writing code to select by element name, which is not something users do, we select by text or placeholder text or something that a user sees. A user is usually going to come to our website and, look either with their eyes or use a screen reader based off of the text. Anyway, so we'll just get practice. Let's try and select this H1 here. Based off of that text, let's count. So I'm going to copy that text. Then I'm going to go to my counter test file. And I'm going to begin by just writing a simple test. We'll just say playing with queries. I'm going to delete this most likely. So we're not actually going to have any expectations in here. But what we are going to do is call render on counter. So we'll make a counter there. And then that returns to us an object. As we've already talked about, it has different methods on there, things like as fragment. What we want, at least to start, is one of these by text methods. So we could do get by text. Why don't we start with that, get by text. So we'll destructure that out. You don't have to do it this way, right? You could just do const object equals render, and then object dot get by text, or test ID or whatever. But usually there's just a couple methods we want out of here. So we'll do get by text. And remember that get by is going to find the first match and throw an error if there are no matches. So get by text equals render counter. Now I can call get by text and pass something in like this string, let's count. So I'll put that in quotes. And let's see what we get back. And to start, we haven't talked about debugging our tests, so I'm just going to console.log this. So we're going to render counter using React testing library's render method. Then that returns an object with a bunch of methods, different ways of querying the rendered result. One of them is get by text. We destructure that. We call it with the text let's count. We print that out. Hopefully, we'll be selecting that H1. Okay, let's see what happens when I run my tests. I'm just going to run the counter.test.js file. So we have, what do we have in there? Snapshot? No, we have a smoke test. So that passes. And here's my console.log. So it did find something. It's this massive object that represents that H1. It has a lot of properties on it. As you can see here, element type is H1. It doesn't have a key. So this is not exactly a DOM node. It represents a DOM node, but it's wrapped up in React stuff. You can see there are references to React here, but it is testable. This is something that we can use, and we'll see some methods, some matchers that we can use. We can fire events based off of these nodes that we select, but we're going to get there. Let's just start by slightly modifying this. Instead of get by text, let's count. Let's try getting rid of that exclamation point. That seems like a pretty minor change. Let's see what happens now. So my test will rerun automatically. Now I get an error, unable to find an element with the text, let's count. Well, why is that going on? It says let's count right there. The way that these queries work is that they are going to be an exact match. So it's looking exactly for some element, something that has the inner text of let's count and nothing else. Now I have a way around that, but we have to go to the docs to figure that out. So if you go to the docs, let's look at by text. Where are you? Right here. These are all the different options we can pass in. So we can add in an options argument as the second argument. What's kind of confusing, if you do look at the documentation, the way that get by text is called here, we actually have to pass in the element, then we pass in the text, and then options. But in the React version, the React variant of testing library, we don't need to pass the container in. We've already rendered something, and we get back a method, get by text, that already knows what it is going to be searching within. So we don't have to specify here some element, let's count, which can throw people off. I totally understand that. But now you know, hopefully, we don't need to do that. We can pass in an object, and one of the properties in that object that we can set is exact, and it defaults to true. But I can set exact to false, so I'm going to do just that right now, right here. Exact, set that to false, if I spell false correctly. Now our test will rerun again, and it should be able to find that H1, and it does. So even though I didn't have the exact text content, I am able to still find it because this is a match, it just doesn't have the exclamation point that's included in that H1. So that's how I'd select that H1. What if I wanted to find all elements? You probably wouldn't do this, but I wanted to find all elements that had count, like that, the actual word count. So I would use a different query. I wouldn't do get by text. I could do get all by text. I need to make sure I'm grabbing that from render, destructure that out, and then I'll update this. Instead of searching for let's count, I'll look for count, the text count. So my test rerun, and now we get an array. And this array contains our first element, which is an H1, that was a match, and the second one is an H2. And that seems correct, right? H1 and H2. Next up, let's talk a little bit more about some of the other methods. So the variations, we have get all by text, we've got query all by text, we've got get by text, query by text, and then the same for set of methods, but for placeholder or for label text, all those different methods that we can use. Let's try doing a get by text. So I'm just going to add that in here, or get all by text on something that is not going to be found. So get by text. How about, I don't think we have any references to cake in that component. So why don't I just call this, I'm not even going to save it to a variable. Let's just print it out. Console.log get by text cake. Remember that when we do get by, it's going to return the first match, and it throws an error if nothing matches. So we get an error over here, right there. Unable to find an element with the text cake. This could be blah, blah, blah. If this is the case, okay, so we get an error, and it lets us know I didn't find anything. If I instead had used query by text, and I update that to be query by text, it's still not going to find anything with cake, but if I scroll up, no problem. I don't get an error. So two different approaches. Often we'll want to use get by because we're expecting something to be there. And if it's not, if we can't find a button that has the text of add, then something is screwed up. We don't want to have that fail silently. But other times you might have some optional stuff, or you might there might be some wiggle room where you don't want an error if something is not there or if you can't find it. And then one other thing that we haven't addressed is if we use query by text and we pass something in that actually will match. So for example, what is something that we have multiple matches for? I guess we can do count again. Now count on its own won't match, but if I also say exact is false, I don't care if it's an exact match. If the entire text is exactly count, just tell me if count is in any of these elements. So if I run that right there, that seems like it should work. It should find something that has text of count, this right here or this right here. But if I run it, I also get an error. And the error this time is I found multiple elements with a text count. If this is intentional, use all by. So not only does it get mad at us if it doesn't find anything with this text, it also gets mad if it finds more than one thing, if we're using query by text or get by text. But if we do query all by text or get all by text, then we're all good. So important distinction there, and remember those variations apply to other methods. So to wrap this portion up, we're still not really writing tests, but we are querying things based off of what we get back from render. Let's quickly update my counter component. I'm going to delete this, but let's update this to have an input. Type equals text, and let's give it a placeholder. Placeholder equals username. Okay, so now we have an input here, and let's also add in a label here that says username, and then let's give that a for attribute. We'll call this, I don't know, user, just to be simple and short, and ID will be user. So now I have a new input, placeholder of username, and I have a label associated with it with that for attribute. So I'm going to get rid of this. We're not using this to do anything except demonstrate our other query methods. So if I wanted to write some queries or some tests where I need to have that input, for example, if I wanted to trigger a typing event or an enter or submit or something, I often need to select an actual input element or a select element, even a checkbox. There are different things we might want to do, different events to fire, which is what we'll talk about next. But first we have to select them. And with React Testing Library, remember the approach is to select by and manipulate and find things the way a user would. So we're not going to select by ID or anything like that. Let's try selecting by placeholder to start. So let's do get by placeholder text. We'll extract that from render. And then let's just console.log. And then get by placeholder text. And then I think our placeholder text was username. So this will hopefully find that input. This is one way of finding an input. We run our test. I didn't really do anything. It just ran on its own. And here it is. We've got an HTML input element. Element type is input. And there's other information in here. You can see attributes or the props. Type is text, placeholder username. And we're able to fire events based off of this once we learn how to do that in the next video. And one other way of selecting that is through the label I just added. So if I added in to my destructuring right here, get by label text, I can replace this with get by label text. And assuming that I have a label associated with that input, which I do, hopefully I set that up correctly, the text of the label is username with a capital U. So at the moment it doesn't find anything. It can't find a label with the text of username. But if I instead update my query to use a capital U for username, it does find that input, and you can see it right here, element type input. So it's not finding the label and returning that element, it's returning the object that represents the input that I selected by that associated label text. Now, one really minor thing, well, it's not minor, but an important, somewhat unrelated topic is that I am getting this error. We haven't talked about forms and labels in React yet, so I kind of jumped the gun, but I just wanted to show some of those other methods. In JavaScript, the keyword for is another reserved word, right? We use for all the time for loops or for ins, for ofs. So just like class is reserved in JavaScript, so the React team decided we use class name. If we're setting up a input or a label where we want that label to have the for attribute in HTML, we actually use HTML4, which will do the same thing. So I'm getting a warning about that, but that's not really the point of this video. I just wanted to show you how we could use these query methods from React Testing Library. All right, so now that this is out of the way, we're able to make our queries. I'll leave this here so you have a reference if you want to open up this file. But next, we're actually going to write tests where we do something. Selecting an element or multiple elements is just the first step. We render, that's really the first step. We find things, hopefully. We query, we get a button, and then we fire an event. We click that button, and then we can check, did something change? Was something re-rendered? Is there a different output, a different number showing? That's what we'll start to talk about next.